Yes, hello again. Welcome back once more to your number one and hopefully your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where we do our very best to try and bring you more of those old vintage classic and twin shock motocross bikes from the 1950s right up to those relatively modern machines of the 1990s. Now, as we head towards the end of 2022, I do hope you've enjoyed most of my content that I've shown here on my channel throughout the year, and if you haven't already subscribed to CDB TV, then I do hope you may consider that very small thing in the future, in order that you don't miss out on any of my future postings in the coming weeks and months. So right now we're going to take a look at a bike that almost got iconic status in the late 1980s, purely due to the fact that this was an American designed and built machine. So we're going to dive straight into that video now and take a look at this lovely 1989 ATK 250 two-stroke motocrosser. Now, here in the UK, the name ATK may not have been too familiar to motocross racers during the late 1980s, but in the USA, ATK motocross and off-road bikes were certainly the latest thing, and they were at that time beginning to build up a cult following within the ranks of dirt bike fanatics. Now, formed around 1985, ATK was the brainchild of Austrian-born racer and engineer Horst Leitner, who in his own right was a Grand Prix and international 6 days motorcycle racing rider, but he was also a very talented motorcycle designer, which is why he then left his native Austria in 1980 and then took his many talents to the USA with a dream of one day designing, building and selling his own brand of racing motorcycles. Now, Horst Leitner eventually saw his dreams come true, and from around 1985 he was then designing chassis and other motorcycle parts to use on his big 500 four-stroke race bikes that at that time were powered by the mighty 500 Rotax four-stroke engine. Now, it was sometime later that Horst Leitner was then approached by the Canadian Bombardier company, who wanted him to build a motorcycle to replace their old Can-Ams that the company had been building for some years. And so Horst then designed and built these ATK 250s using a Rotax two-stroke engine, and this brand new bike was also available with a much bigger 406 Rotax two-stroke power plant. And so our featured bike here is a 1989 250, and although this example here isn't maybe 100% original from that year, it's still as near as damn it as to what one of these 250s would have looked like back in 1989. Although when Horst Leitner first formed his company in the mid-1980s, obviously he needed a name for his brand new venture, so Horst then decided to name the company after his latest invention, which was a design to eliminate chain torque, which was called the anti-tension Kettenantrieb, which in English roughly translates to anti-chain tension, and so the name ATK was then born. But these ATK 250s weren't just another American-made dirt bike, because these were bristling with Horst Leitner's ideas and designs, and for 1989 these Leitner ATKs were just full of innovative ideas on how to make an ordinary motocross race bike a whole lot better. So let's just get started with the bike's chassis, which was made of chrome moly steel tubing, which was a bit unusual for 1989 when you consider that many other dirt bike manufacturers of that period had already made the switch to alloy frames. But once again, Horst Leitner was of the view that if these steel frames were designed correctly and using the right diameter tubing, they could still be every bit as light as an alloy chassis, but have a much greater tensile strength and therefore endure much greater punishment when it was on the track. Now, the chassis swing arm was also made of steel, but unlike the frame, this part was just a simple square box section type of construction. But again, by using the correct grade and the diameter of the steel, this kept the overall weight of this part to a respectable level. But more importantly, it was a lot stronger than maybe a softer, lighter alloy one would have been, which again all helped towards the strength and reliability of the bike. And so as we move on to the power plant on our ATK, which was an Austrian-made Rotax 250 two-stroke rotary valve intake engine, which for 1989 were available in either this 250 version or the much bigger 406 motor. But essentially these were the very same engines that powered Bombardier's Can-Am bikes years before. And to supply the engine with its fuel, it was a 35mm flat slide Mikuni carburetor that fed the fuel air mixture into a rotating fibre disc valve that was on the end of the crankshaft that spun around an opening in the casing, whereby causing suction, and then the fuel and air mixture was then sucked into the crankcases to be ignited. But this quite unique rotary disc valve intake system had already been used on some of the early Japanese Yamaha road bikes of the 1970s, because I remember my old Yamaha YB100 certainly had a similar version of this disc valve setup. But these Rotax motors did use a certain amount of magnesium in their motors casings construction, so that all helped towards keeping the overall weight of this bike to a respectable level, which as I remember was only just over the 200 pounds dry weight mark, which was pretty good for a 250 in that year. Now, the air intake system for the engine was another Horst Leitner design, and it was a kind of snorkel type setup with the air intake here right at the front of the bike, just underneath the fuel tank, and there was also a big plastic hollow tube that then routed the air into a large kind of plastic holding tank just behind the engine. Now, it's said that this plastic holding tank would store high volumes of air to then be fed through that disc valve intake system and then into the combustion chamber, although the actual air filter itself was fitted to the end of the snorkel tubing, and it was housed in this much smaller plastic box, which was located here just below the front of the fuel tank. But once more, the motor's exhaust expansion chamber isn't, of course, the original part from 1989, which isn't surprising really, considering our old ATK's about 33 years old now. But these front and centre exhausts did suffer from being hit with stones and other track debris when they were being raced So stock original race pipes did have a relatively short working life and were repaired or replaced more or less on a regular basis. But I'm pretty sure that this is still the correct tailpipe for our 250, as these tailpipes never encountered the same fate as its front counterpart. So subsequently these never received the same damage and lasted a lot longer. Which brings us now to just exactly how ATK got their name back in 1985, and it was all down to this very radical chain rear brake and primary drive sprocket system that was designed by the great Horst Leitner himself. But basically this was an anti-chain torque setup using a series of guide pulleys that would still allow the suspension to move freely when it was under load and the power was being applied to the back wheel. And in this clip here you can get a better idea of just how these pulleys were all arranged on the bike's swing arm, with a series of rollers on the top with a similar arrangement here on the bottom. But as I said, this anti-tension system is where Horst Leitner got the name for his new bike manufacturing company, and it's all due to this system that he named it ATK as an abbreviation of this anti-tension kitten and tribe invention. Now, another Leitner innovation on this ATK 1989 250 was to take the rear Grimeka hydraulic disc brake off the back of the wheel and then bolt it on here as part of the chain's primary drive sprocket. Now, this was all done to take excess weight off of that back wheel and lessen the unsprung weight on the suspension when it was bobbing up and down over bumpy racetracks. But as you can see, it was extremely radical in its design and very different from the conventional rear disc brake systems fitted to ATK's competition in 1989. Although whether it actually performed better in this position rather than being fixed onto the back wheel, I'm not exactly sure. And to operate that rear disc brake, Leitner then took the rear brake pedal and its master cylinder, and then he mounted it on the chassis here just at the front of the engine. And he also turned the pedal around so that it was facing backwards, and his thinking here was that because it was rear facing, that if you dropped the bike onto its side, then it would be less likely to get bent or damaged. And as far as I know, it actually did work, although in this position it might be a bit more prone to damage from stones or other track debris. And so now moving on to the front end of our Horst Leitner bike, it was a pair of Dutch-made white power upside down forks that were bolted on to these 89 250s, and these once more were quite decent suspension units for their day, and they did have a bit of scope for adjustment and tuning to the rebound and damping, but this was still at the late 1980s, of course, when suspension systems for motocross bikes were just evolving. But Leitner had been using these white power forks since he started ATK in 1985, and these have been very successful on those big Rotax four-strokers that he designed and built at that time. So this is more than likely the reason that Horst Leitner continued with them on these much lighter two-strokes. And again, for a late 1980s motocrosser, the back of the bike had a single rear monoshock with a piggyback remote gas and oil reservoir, but no linkage on this shock to connect it to the frame and swing arm, just a simple connection bolted on to either end. But again, it was a Dutch-made white power unit, which, as I just said, was the staple suspension setup on most of Leitner's ATKs. But another of Horst's innovations was to bolt the rear shock onto the outside of the left-hand side of the bike, where it could be accessed easily during a race situation, and rather than having it sitting right in the middle of the chassis, where it would be a major job to get to it for either servicing or repair. But this Leitner idea was just a case of removing the top and bottom bolts, and it was a relatively quick swap. Again, with regards the bike's front stopper, this was just a Grimeka twin pot hydraulic disc brake, which as 1980s motorcycle disc brakes go, this was pretty basic, because it was just a simple twin piston affair and maybe not as powerful as the multi-pot caliper brakes that we're used to nowadays on our modern motocross bikes. But again, both the bike's front and rear wheels are not the originals from that year, but these are a replacement pair of SM Pro Platinum alloy wheels, which will be every bit as good, if not better, than the rims that would have been fitted to these ATKs in '89. And so moving on now to the fuel cell of our American-made ATK, which was a simple plastic tank, which was pretty much the standard material that was now being used on motocross motorcycle tanks during the 1980s. And this fuel cell normally held around, I think it was about 12 litres or about 2.7 gallons of premixed fuel. But the size of this tank is a bit deceiving when it's viewed from this left-hand side, because that bottom section there is of course the air filter and not actually part of the tank itself. But another Leitner idea was to fit the fuel filler cap to this right-hand side of the tank, which was all done just to try and make it easier to fill when you were standing at the side of the bike. Now, the seat on our 250 was just a relatively standard design on just about all motocross bikes of that period, with this type of high boy style effect that crept up the rear of the fuel tank, which was all done just to try and enable the rider to shift his weight from the back of the bike to the front end and help the machine make some tighter turns. But this seat is still the original part from '89, as is many of the other components that are bolted on to this quite rare machine. But you'd think that the plastics on our ATK would have been a bit more battered and bruised after its previous racing years on the track, although as far as I'm aware, these are all still the original Acerbis plastics that were fitted to the bike back in that year. And whether these are replacements, I'm not really sure, but they certainly keep the bike looking fresh. And as rare as these 250 two-strokes are here in the UK, this example is still a cracking looking bike. But as we move on to the business end of our Horst Leitner creation, we have a stock pair of Renthal handlebars there, with a pair of Pro Grip rubber handlebar grips on each end of the bars. Now, a pair of alloy Magura levers for both the clutch and the front brake, and you can also see the master cylinder there for that hydraulic Grimeka front disc brake. Now that engine kill switch there on the left wouldn't have been a standard fitting on these ATKs at the factory in '89, but it looks like this has been added sometime later just to try and provide a bit of security in case of any engine problems with that Rotax motor. Now the gasser throttle is a Magura 314 Duo unit, and this has the job of controlling all of those horses inside that 250 two-stroke engine. Although these 250s weren't as much of a handful as its more powerful bigger brother, the mighty 406. Although for the late 1980s, there's certainly no doubt these ATKs were very different from anything that was racing on the track in that year, and with all of Horst Leitner's ideas and innovations all bolted into one motorcycle, this was certainly the perfect platform to show off his bike building skills. Although let's not forget that Horst Leitner, prior to building these two-strokers, had already been using these ATK technologies on his big 500 Rotax four-stroke bikes, which were also hugely successful and certainly sold in big numbers across the USA. But those bigger 500 thumpers weren't cheap, and they did have price tags in the region of $7,000 to $10,000 at that time. So if you could afford a thumper 500 ATK in the 1980s, then you were certainly a very special person indeed. Although nevertheless our particular 1989 250 here is still quite a good example of one of these American made machines, and despite it not being 100% original because of its replacement wheels and exhaust system, I think it's still just great to be able to take a look at one once again, because although these 250s were all made in the United States, it's very rare to even see one here in the UK, let alone see one take to a track. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around that 1989 250 ATK two-stroke machine, a bike of course that was designed and built in the USA by Austrian engineer Horst Leitner. So when we return to Classic Dirt Bike TV, in my next video posting we'll be checking out this very rare 1980 Wilco Moto 500. Now this was a British built machine, and every component that was used in its construction was manufactured by the one company. So we'll be taking a look around this very rare machine when we return to CDB TV. But until then, of course, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well when you're riding your old vintage classics, and I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of this old school type of vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.